funny thing about regret, Daniel Brooks once told a friend, laughing over a glass of bourbon, it only shows up after the door is already closed. Tonight, standing beneath the golden chandeliers of the Manhattan Grand Regent Hotel, he would discover just how true that was. The ballroom glowed with quiet luxury, crystal glasses chiming softly, polished marble floors reflecting the warm light of 1,000 bulbs, and the low hum of powerful conversations drifting through the air. Daniel adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit and glanced around the room, trying to steady the nervous energy buzzing in his chest. Events like this were supposed to excite him. The Carter Global Investment Gala was one of the most exclusive gatherings in the country, a place where founders, venture capitalists, and billion-dollar ideas collided over champagne and quiet negotiations. His startup desperately needed a break, and tonight might be his only shot. Waiters in black vests floated through the crowd offering silver trays of sparkling drinks, while guests spoke in confident murmurs about acquisitions and market expansions. Daniel forced a polite smile as he accepted a glass, pretending he belonged among them. Truthfully, the last 12 months had been brutal. Funding rounds had collapsed, partners had grown impatient, and the company he once bragged about was now barely holding together. Still, he had convinced himself that tonight could change everything. All he needed was the right investor to notice him. On the massive screen at the front of the ballroom, a presentation scrolled through the names of the evening's key sponsors. Some were familiar giants in tech and finance, but one name seemed to command the most attention whenever it appeared: Carter Global Ventures. Daniel heard it whispered repeatedly around the room, always with a tone of respect, sometimes even awe. They've backed half the fastest-growing companies in the last decade, someone nearby said. Their founder rarely shows up in person, another voice added. When she does, people listen. Daniel barely paid attention at first. Investors came and went. What mattered was convincing one of them to believe in his vision. He lifted the champagne to his lips when the ballroom lights dimmed slightly and a ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd. The host stepped onto the stage, smiling as the room gradually quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced, his voice echoing warmly across the hall, "tonight we are honored to welcome someone whose leadership has transformed the world of venture capital." Daniel shifted his weight, glancing casually toward the stage. "She built Carter Global Ventures into a multi-billion-dollar powerhouse before the age of 40, the host continued. And her investments have shaped the future of technology across the United States. Applause began rising like a gathering wave. Daniel looked down at his phone for a second, barely interested, until the host said the name. "Please join me in welcoming our founder, Emily Carter." The glass slipped from Daniel's fingers before he even realized his hand had gone numb. It struck the marble floor with a sharp crack that seemed far too loud in the suddenly silent world around him, because at that exact moment the ballroom doors opened, and the woman who walked through them was the last person Daniel Brooks ever expected to see again. 3 years earlier, he had walked away from her without hesitation, convinced he was leaving behind a life that had grown dull and ordinary. But now, as Emily Carter stepped into the golden light of the gala, calm, confident, and greeted by a room full of standing applause, Daniel felt something tighten painfully in his chest. Because the quiet woman he once abandoned had just been introduced as one of the most powerful billionaires in the room. For a moment Daniel Brooks could not hear the applause anymore. The ballroom was still clapping, still celebrating the arrival of one of the most powerful investors in the country. Yet the sound seemed distant, like it was coming from another room far away. His eyes stayed fixed on the woman walking toward the stage. Emily Carter. The same calm posture. The same steady way she carried herself. But everything else about her felt different. 3 years earlier, the last time he had seen her, she had been standing in the small kitchen of their house outside Seattle, wearing a simple sweater and stirring a pot of soup that had long gone cold. Back then the house had been quiet, almost too quiet, and Daniel had already made up his mind before he even walked through the front door. He remembered dropping his keys on the counter and avoiding her eyes while she asked if he was coming home late again. The truth was that he had already stopped thinking of that place as home. The time he believed he was meant for something bigger, something more exciting than quiet dinners and slow evenings. That was also around the time Vanessa Clark had entered his life. Vanessa was lively, confident, always surrounded by music and bright conversations. She worked in marketing and seemed to know every interesting restaurant in the city. When she laughed, the entire room noticed. Compared to that energy, Emily had begun to feel invisible to him. At least that was what Daniel convinced himself of. Emily rarely complained about his long hours. She never pushed him to chase money or status. She simply worked quietly on her laptop most nights while he scrolled through his phone or answered emails. Daniel interpreted that silence as lack of ambition. He told himself she was comfortable living small. The night everything ended had been strangely calm. No shouting. No dramatic accusations. Daniel had placed a suitcase by the door and explained that he had met someone else and that the marriage was not working anymore. Emily had listened without interrupting. Her expression had not changed much. She had only asked one quiet question. Was this really what he wanted? Daniel remembered nodding quickly, almost impatiently, eager to move forward into what he believed would be a better life. Emily did not beg him to stay. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there for a moment, looking at him as if she was memorizing the person he used to be. Then she stepped aside and let him walk out. That part had always stayed with him, though he rarely admitted it. The way she had allowed the door to close without chasing after him had somehow made the decision feel easier at the time. Within a year Daniel had married Vanessa, and most of his friends congratulated him. They said he had upgraded his life. They said he looked happier, more successful, more alive. Daniel believed them. He told himself that leaving Emily had been the right choice. Now, standing in the glowing ballroom of the Manhattan Grand Regent, watching the same quiet woman receive a standing ovation from some of the most powerful people in the country, Daniel felt the ground under his certainty begin to shift. Because the woman he once thought lacked ambition was now being welcomed as the founder of Carter Global Ventures, a name that every serious investor in the room seemed to respect. And as Emily reached the stage, accepting the microphone with a composed smile, Daniel felt a strange realization slowly forming in his mind, a realization that made his chest tighten with a kind of unease he could not yet explain. For the first time since their divorce, Daniel Brooks was beginning to wonder if there had been an entire world behind Emily Carter that he had never even bothered to see. Daniel Brooks remained standing among the crowd long after the applause had settled into a quiet murmur. Emily Carter stood at the front of the ballroom now, the warm stage lights outlining her calm expression as she thanked the audience with a composed voice. There was nothing dramatic about the way she spoke. No grand gestures, no attempt to impress anyone. Yet every person in the room seemed to listen carefully, as if her words carried weight far beyond the microphone. Daniel felt something strange settle in his chest as he watched her. It was not simply surprise anymore. It was the slow realization that the entire room saw Emily very differently from the way he once had. She spoke about innovation, about investing in founders who believed in building something meaningful, about patience and long-term thinking. The audience responded with thoughtful nods and quiet smiles. These were people who managed billion-dollar companies, yet they listened to Emily Carter with genuine respect. Daniel remembered how different things had looked years ago in their small house outside Seattle. Emily had often worked late into the night at the dining table, her laptop glowing softly while the rest of the house slept. Daniel used to assume she was doing freelance consulting or helping small startups organize their finances. Sometimes he would walk past her and ask casually what she was working on, and she would answer with simple words about research or market analysis. At the time he barely listened. His own ambitions filled most of his attention. He believed success meant loud momentum, fast growth, constant excitement. Emily had never chased attention in that way. She had been quiet, focused, patient. Daniel had mistaken that patience for lack of drive. Standing in the ballroom now, he watched as the screen behind her displayed images of companies Carter Global Ventures had supported. Technology firms in California, clean energy projects across the Midwest, healthcare. Innovations that had expanded across the country. Each slide revealed numbers that made Daniel feel increasingly small. Billions in growth. Thousands of jobs created. Global recognition. The room applauded again as the presentation ended, and several investors stood to greet her when she stepped down from the stage. People moved toward her with genuine excitement, eager to shake her hand and speak with her. Daniel stayed frozen where he was, holding an empty champagne glass he had forgotten to replace. A quiet voice beside him suddenly said, "She is remarkable, is she not?" Daniel turned and saw an older man in a navy suit smiling toward the stage. The man continued speaking casually, as if sharing a well-known fact. Emily Carter built Carter Global Ventures from a small research project nearly a decade ago. Brilliant instincts. Very private person though. Rarely attends events like this. Daniel felt his throat tighten slightly. Nearly a decade ago. That meant Emily had already been building something extraordinary, while they were still married. The realization arrived slowly but unmistakably. All those quiet evenings when she worked at the dining table were never about small freelance projects. They had been the early foundation of a company that would eventually shape industries. Daniel had walked past history in the making every night without noticing. As he looked back toward the crowd gathering around Emily, another uncomfortable truth settled in his mind. The woman he once believed was living an ordinary life had never been ordinary at all. The only ordinary thing in that marriage had been his willingness to stop paying attention. Daniel Brooks continued watching from the edge of the ballroom, as a steady line of investors and executives approached Emily Carter to greet her. The atmosphere around her felt different from the rest of the room, almost like a quiet center of gravity that naturally pulled people closer. She listened carefully to each person who spoke to her, shaking hands, smiling politely, answering questions with calm confidence. Nothing about her behavior suggested arrogance. If anything, she seemed exactly the same as the woman Daniel remembered from years ago, thoughtful and composed, only now the entire room treated her words as if they carried real influence. Daniel slowly set his empty glass on a passing tray, barely noticing the waiter who took it away. His attention remained fixed on Emily as fragments of old memories began to return with uncomfortable clarity. There had been many evenings when she stayed up long after midnight reviewing financial reports and writing notes across yellow legal pads. At the time Daniel had assumed she was simply being cautious with money, or studying market trends for curiosity. He had even joked once that she worked harder than most accountants he knew. Emily had only smiled faintly and returned to her laptop without explaining further. Now the memory felt different, as if he had been standing beside a hidden engine that was quietly building momentum, while he looked the other way. The older investor who had spoken earlier was still nearby and continued talking casually, clearly unaware of Daniel's connection to the woman on stage. He explained that Carter Global Ventures had become one of the most respected investment firms in the country, because Emily had an unusual ability to see potential long before others did. According to him, several companies that were now worth billions had received their earliest funding from her, when almost no one else believed in them. Daniel listened in silence, feeling a growing weight settle inside his thoughts. He had spent the last few years chasing investors for his own startup, preparing presentations, sending proposals, waiting weeks for replies that rarely came. Meanwhile, Emily had been the one deciding which founders deserved a chance. The contrast was difficult to ignore. Across the ballroom, someone laughed warmly as another group congratulated her on a recent investment that had expanded nationwide. Daniel caught a glimpse of her again as she turned slightly toward the crowd, the soft light reflecting off the glass walls behind her. She looked confident but never dramatic, steady in a way that made people trust her presence. For the first time, Daniel began to understand something that had never crossed his mind before. Emily had never tried to prove herself loudly. She had simply built something meaningful while the rest of the world was busy talking. A quiet realization followed close behind that thought. When Daniel left their marriage 3 years earlier, he believed he was stepping toward a brighter future with someone more exciting. He believed he was leaving behind a life that lacked ambition and momentum. Now, watching the most influential people in the room gather around the woman he once overlooked, he felt a subtle shift inside his perspective. The truth unfolding in front of him was simple but impossible to ignore. The quiet life he had walked away from had never been small at all. He had just never stayed long enough to understand it. Daniel Brooks stayed near the far side of the ballroom long after most of the crowd had shifted closer to Emily Carter. The music had resumed softly, a quiet piano melody drifting through the tall glass walls of the Manhattan Grand Regent, and waiters continued moving through the room with trays of sparkling drinks and small plates. Yet Daniel hardly noticed any of it. His attention remained fixed on the growing circle of people speaking with Emily. From where he stood, he could see the way investors leaned slightly forward when she spoke, the way several executives waited patiently for their turn to introduce themselves. It was not the loud attention that celebrities often received. It was something quieter, deeper, the kind of respect that came from trust built over many years. Daniel had spent the last few hours trying to convince himself that this moment was simply a strange coincidence. Perhaps Emily had joined the company recently. Perhaps she had inherited part of the firm. But the conversations around him had already made the truth impossible to avoid. Carter Global Ventures was her creation. She had built it piece by piece long before anyone in this room realized how powerful it would become. A memory surfaced unexpectedly, small but sharp. One Sunday afternoon years ago, Emily had asked him a simple question while they were sitting at their kitchen table. She had been reviewing numbers on her laptop, a notebook open beside her filled with careful handwriting. She asked what he thought about early-stage technology startups and whether people often underestimated founders who moved quietly. Daniel remembered answering without much thought. He had shrugged and said that success usually belonged to the loudest and most aggressive players in the market. Emily had nodded slowly as if considering the idea. Then she had closed her notebook and smiled politely before changing the subject. At the time, Daniel believed the conversation had meant nothing. Now the memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. She had not been asking a random question. She had been studying the exact world that she would later dominate. Across the ballroom, Emily finished another conversation and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a server. For a brief moment she stood alone, scanning the room with the same calm awareness Daniel remembered from their early years together. She had always been observant like that, noticing details most people ignored. Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly as he realized something else he had never understood before. Emily had never tried to compete for attention during their marriage, because she had been focused on building something real. She had been planning years ahead while he was chasing excitement in the present. Somewhere near the stage, another guest laughed while discussing investment strategies, but Daniel barely heard the sound. A different thought had begun to take shape inside his mind. Over the past year, his own company had struggled more than he admitted to most people. Funding had stalled, partnerships had faded, and several potential investors had already declined meetings. Tonight he had arrived at the gala hoping to impress someone important enough to change his company's future. Now he stood in the same room as one of the most influential investors in the country. And that investor happened to be the woman he once left behind without hesitation. Daniel did not yet know what he would say if he walked across the room to speak with her. But as he watched Emily Carter calmly greeting the next group of executives approaching her, he understood something with growing certainty. The past he believed was finished had just stepped directly back into his life. And this time the balance of power looked completely different. Daniel Brooks remained where he stood for several more minutes, watching the quiet rhythm of the room slowly reorganize around Emily Carter. Conversations formed and dissolved in gentle waves as investors moved from one discussion to another, yet Emily seemed to remain at the center of it all without making any effort to control the attention. She listened carefully when people spoke to her and responded with the same calm confidence Daniel remembered from years ago. The difference now was that every person speaking with her clearly valued her opinion. Daniel felt a growing tension inside his chest as he realized something else that had not occurred to him earlier in the evening. 3 years ago, when he walked away from their marriage, Emily had not tried to stop him. She had not demanded explanations or argued about fairness. The time he believed her silence meant she did not care enough to fight for the relationship. But standing here tonight, watching the way she carried herself in a room full of powerful investors, Daniel began to see that moment differently. Emily had not been powerless when he left. She had simply chosen not to chase someone who had already made up his mind. A quiet voice behind him interrupted his thoughts. 2 younger entrepreneurs were speaking near the bar, discussing Carter Global Ventures with open admiration. One of them mentioned that Emily was known for studying founders carefully before investing, often observing how they behaved in difficult situations rather than only reviewing their financial projections. The other entrepreneur replied that she rarely made emotional decisions, and that her patience was one of the reasons her firm had avoided so many risky deals over the years. Daniel listened without turning around, absorbing every word. Patience had always been one of Emily's quiet strengths. Even during the final weeks of their marriage, when his attention had shifted almost completely toward Vanessa, and the excitement of a new relationship, Emily had never reacted with anger. She had simply watched, listened, and eventually accepted the truth of what he had already decided. At the time, Daniel believed that calm reaction confirmed his assumption that the marriage had lost its importance to her. Now he began to understand something else. Emily had never tried to hold on to something that no longer respected her presence. Across the ballroom, the line of people greeting her had finally started to thin. A few investors remained in conversation with her near the stage, but the crowd had spread out again as the evening continued. Daniel noticed that for the first time since her arrival she was standing with only one colleague beside her, speaking quietly while reviewing something on a tablet. The distance between them was not large, perhaps 30 feet across the polished marble floor. Daniel felt a quiet debate forming in his mind. Part of him wanted to remain exactly where he was, and let the night pass without drawing attention to their past. But another part of him recognized that opportunities like this did not appear twice. His company needed investors, and Carter Global Ventures clearly had the resources to support ambitious projects. The thought created a complicated mixture of hesitation and determination. He had spent the entire evening watching from a distance, allowing memories and regrets to circle through his thoughts. Now a simple question remained: whether he would continue standing quietly in the corner of the room, or finally walk across the floor and speak to the woman whose life had become far more extraordinary than he had ever imagined. Daniel Brooks stood still for a few seconds longer, watching Emily Carter speak quietly with the colleague beside her, and he realized that if he waited any longer the moment would disappear the same way so many opportunities already had over the past year. The distance between them was not large, yet crossing it suddenly felt far more difficult than walking into any investor meeting he had faced before. He took a slow breath and straightened his jacket, reminding himself that tonight he was here as the founder of a company seeking support, not as a man revisiting old memories. With that thought, he stepped forward and began walking across the polished marble floor of the ballroom. The soft music continued in the background while clusters of guests chatted beneath the golden chandeliers, but Daniel noticed none of it. His attention was fixed entirely on the woman standing near the stage. As he approached, Emily finished her conversation with the colleague and handed the tablet back to him with a polite nod. The colleague thanked her and moved away into the crowd, leaving her momentarily alone. For the first time that evening there was a clear path between them. Daniel stopped a few feet away, suddenly aware that the last time they had spoken face to face had been the night he carried a suitcase out of their house in Seattle. Emily turned slightly as if sensing someone nearby. Her eyes met his with a calm expression that revealed no surprise and no discomfort. For a brief second Daniel wondered if she had already noticed him earlier in the evening, and simply chosen not to interrupt the flow of the event. Emily offered the same polite smile she gave to many guests that night, but there was also a quiet recognition in her gaze. "Hello, Daniel," she said in a steady voice that carried neither warmth nor hostility. It sounded like a simple greeting between two people who had once known each other well, and had since become strangers again. Daniel felt an unexpected mix of relief and unease. Part of him had imagined this moment filled with awkward tension or unresolved anger, yet Emily's tone suggested something very different. She appeared composed, almost peaceful, as if the past between them had already settled into its proper place long ago. "Hello, Emily," he replied, carefully choosing a calm tone of his own. "It has been a long time." Emily nodded slightly as she lifted her glass of water and set it back down on the nearby table. "Yes, it has been a few years," she answered. "I hope you have been well." The question sounded sincere, but it also carried a quiet distance that Daniel could not ignore. He realized that while he had spent the last hour reliving old memories, Emily seemed fully grounded in the present moment. She was not looking backward at all. Daniel glanced briefly around the ballroom, noticing once again the influential investors moving through the room, the quiet respect many of them directed toward her, and the unmistakable reality that Emily Carter now belonged to a world far larger than the one they once shared. For a moment he hesitated, aware that the conversation standing in front of him was no longer about their past marriage. It was about the present opportunity that had brought him here. Daniel finally spoke again, choosing his words carefully. "I did not realize until tonight that Carter Global Ventures was yours." Emily studied him for a second with the same thoughtful calm she had shown on stage earlier. Then she gave a small nod. Yes, she said simply. I started building it several years ago. Her answer was direct and modest, yet the meaning behind it filled the quiet space between them with an undeniable truth. The life Daniel once walked away from had grown into something far more powerful than he had ever imagined. Daniel Brooks remained standing in front of Emily Carter, still adjusting to the calm steadiness in her voice. The noise of the ballroom continued around them, glasses clinking softly, conversations drifting through the air, but the small space between them felt strangely quiet. Emily looked exactly the same in one important way. She still carried herself with the same composed patience that had once filled the small house they shared in Seattle. The difference now was that the entire room seemed to move around her rhythm. Daniel cleared his throat slightly, aware that he needed to say something meaningful, yet the words did not come easily. I suppose I should congratulate you, he said after a moment. What you built here is impressive. Emily gave a small nod, accepting the compliment without exaggeration. Thank you, Daniel. It took time, but I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to build. Her answer sounded simple, but Daniel could hear the quiet confidence behind it. Years ago he had rarely asked what those ideas were. At the time he believed his own career was the center of their future. He remembered the countless evenings when Emily had quietly worked beside him while he discussed his plans for expansion, market growth, and big opportunities that always seemed just one step away. Emily had listened patiently then, often asking thoughtful questions, yet she had rarely spoken at length about her own ambitions. Daniel had assumed she simply did not have the same hunger for success. Standing here now, that assumption felt painfully incomplete. Emily glanced briefly toward the stage where another speaker had begun addressing a small group of investors. When she turned back, her attention returned fully to Daniel as if she was giving the conversation the same focus she gave any other professional discussion. So what brings you to the gala tonight? She asked calmly. Daniel hesitated for a second before answering honestly. I started a technology company a few years ago. We are building a platform that helps small businesses manage digital operations more efficiently. The idea has strong potential, but we are currently searching for the right investors to help us scale nationally. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful but neutral. Daniel continued speaking, explaining the product, the market opportunity, and the challenges his company had faced in securing long-term funding. As he spoke, he became aware of a strange shift inside himself. In the past, he would have tried to impress her with confident claims and bold predictions. Tonight his tone was different. There was more honesty in his voice, perhaps because the balance between them had changed so clearly. When he finished explaining, Emily took a moment before responding. That is an interesting direction, she said. Small businesses often struggle with digital systems that are too complicated or too expensive. A platform designed well could certainly help them. Daniel felt a small spark of hope at her thoughtful response. For the first time that evening, the conversation felt less like an awkward reunion and more like the kind of discussion that happened between founders and investors. Yet Emily's next question reminded him that she had always been observant long before she became a respected venture capitalist. How long has the company been operating? She asked gently. Daniel answered truthfully. Almost 3 years now. Emily gave a slow nod as if placing that timeline into context. 3 years was not a random number. It was exactly the amount of time that had passed since Daniel walked away from their marriage. Neither of them mentioned the coincidence directly, yet the quiet understanding hung between them as clearly as the music echoing softly through the ballroom. Daniel Brooks noticed the subtle pause after Emily Carter repeated the number of years his company had existed. 3 years. The same quiet stretch of time that had passed since the night he walked out of their house in Seattle. Neither of them commented on the coincidence, yet Daniel felt the weight of it settle quietly in his thoughts. Emily's expression remained calm and attentive, the same thoughtful look she often carried when she evaluated new ideas. She was not judging him, but she was clearly studying the situation the way an experienced investor would. Daniel realized that for the first time since their conversation began, he was no longer speaking to his former wife. He was speaking to the founder of Carter Global Ventures, a woman who had built one of the most respected venture firms in the country. Emily rested one hand lightly on the edge of the small table beside them and asked another question in the same steady tone. What stage is the company in right now? Daniel answered honestly. We have a working platform and several pilot clients using the system, but expansion has been slower than expected. We need stronger financial backing to scale the product across more markets. Emily nodded slowly as she absorbed the information. That response alone told Daniel she understood the situation clearly. Many early-stage companies reached exactly that point, where the concept showed promise but growth required serious capital and experienced guidance. Emily glanced briefly across the ballroom as another group of guests entered the hall, then returned her focus to Daniel. Have you presented the company to other investors yet? She asked. Daniel allowed himself a small, tired smile. Yes, quite a few actually. Some meetings went well, but most investors want to see faster revenue growth before committing larger funding. Emily seemed unsurprised by that answer. Early investors are often cautious with platforms that require long-term adoption from small businesses, she said thoughtfully. They prefer markets where returns move more quickly. Daniel listened carefully. The way she explained it was calm and analytical, the same way she once broke down household budgets or long-term plans when they were married. The difference now was that her understanding had grown into something far more sophisticated. Daniel hesitated before speaking again, aware that he was approaching the real reason he had crossed the ballroom to talk to her. I was hoping to connect with potential partners tonight, he admitted. Investors who understand the long-term value of building reliable systems for small businesses. Emily studied him quietly for a moment. There was no tension in her expression, only the careful attention of someone considering new information. Daniel realized that the outcome of this conversation no longer depended on their past. It depended entirely on whether Emily believed in the idea he was presenting. Around them the ballroom continued moving with steady energy, waiters carrying trays, guests discussing deals, soft music drifting through the air. Yet Daniel's focus remained on the woman standing in front of him. Emily finally spoke again with the same composed tone she had carried throughout the evening. I review many proposals every month, Daniel. But the companies that interest me the most are usually the ones built with patience and clear purpose. She paused briefly before continuing. If you have a detailed proposal for your platform, you are welcome to send it to my office. The answer was professional, measured, and neither encouraging nor dismissive. Yet Daniel understood something important in that moment. The conversation had not ended with polite nostalgia about their past. Instead it had moved naturally into the present world where Emily Carter now made decisions that shaped the future of companies across the country. Daniel Brooks listened carefully as Emily Carter finished speaking, her voice calm and professional, offering him the same opportunity she would give any founder seeking investment. Send the proposal to her office. The words were simple, yet they carried more weight than Daniel expected. For a moment he simply nodded, absorbing the reality of the situation. 3 years ago he had walked away from a quiet marriage believing he was stepping into a brighter future. Now he stood in front of the woman he left behind, asking for the same kind of support that countless entrepreneurs across the country hoped to receive from her firm. Thank you, Emily, he said after a moment, his voice steady but thoughtful. I appreciate the chance to present it properly. Emily gave a polite nod, the kind that signaled both courtesy and professionalism. Of course. Good ideas deserve careful review. Around them the ballroom continued flowing with conversations, and another pair of investors approached nearby, clearly waiting for a moment to speak with her. Daniel noticed the subtle shift in their posture as they recognized Emily standing only a few feet away. The influence she carried in this room was unmistakable. For a brief second Daniel considered saying something about their past, perhaps acknowledging how much time had passed since their lives had separated. But the words never formed. Emily's calm presence made it clear that the past was no longer the center of this moment. What mattered now were the choices each of them had made since then. Instead Daniel spoke about the company again, explaining one feature of the platform that had recently helped a small retail chain simplify its digital inventory system. Emily listened attentively, asking a short question about how the software handled seasonal demand. Daniel answered with more detail, describing the algorithm they had built to track patterns over time. The conversation continued for another minute in the same focused tone, almost like a brief professional meeting held in the middle of a crowded ballroom. Yet as Daniel spoke, a quiet realization slowly grew clearer in his mind. The woman standing in front of him had built her entire future without needing anything from him after he left. She had not called him for advice, had not asked for support, and had never tried to prove anything to him. She had simply continued forward with the same quiet determination he once overlooked. Across the room someone called Emily's name politely, and she glanced in that direction before returning her attention to Daniel. "I should speak with a few other guests before the evening ends," she said calmly, "but I will have my office review your proposal when it arrives." Daniel nodded again, understanding that the conversation had reached its natural end. "Thank you for your time tonight," he replied. Emily offered the same composed smile she had shown many others during the evening. "You are welcome, Daniel. I wish you the best with the company." The words were sincere and respectful, yet they carried a quiet finality that Daniel felt immediately. Emily turned toward the group waiting nearby, greeting them with the same calm professionalism that had filled the entire evening. Daniel remained standing for a moment longer, watching as the room once again shifted around her presence. The music continued, the conversations resumed, and the elegant rhythm of the gala carried forward. But Daniel Brooks understood something now that had not been clear to him 3 years earlier. The life he once walked away from had not been standing still after he left. It had been quietly moving forward, building something powerful enough to fill an entire ballroom with respect. Daniel Brooks slowly stepped away from the circle forming around Emily Carter, and moved toward the quieter side of the ballroom. The music continued softly under the golden lights, and conversations flowed easily among the guests, yet the atmosphere felt different to him now. A few minutes earlier he had been standing in front of the woman who once shared his life, asking for the same professional consideration that hundreds of entrepreneurs across the country hoped to receive from her company. The realization carried a strange mix of humility and clarity. Daniel walked toward the tall windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, and rested his hand lightly on the back of an empty chair. Outside, the city stretched endlessly with bright towers and steady traffic moving through the night. He had spent years believing success meant moving faster than everyone else, making louder moves, chasing the next exciting opportunity. Emily had chosen a very different path. She had moved quietly, patiently, building something strong enough that the entire room respected her presence without her ever needing to demand attention. Daniel thought back to the early days of their marriage when they first moved into the small house in Seattle. At the time both of them were still trying to build their futures. Daniel had been full of restless energy, always talking about the next business plan, the next partnership, the next chance to grow bigger. Emily had listened patiently while working on her own ideas late into the night. She had never competed with his ambitions. She simply focused on her own work with a calm determination that now made much more sense than it once did. Across the ballroom Daniel could still see Emily speaking with another group of investors, her posture relaxed and confident as she answered their questions. The scene felt almost symbolic. 3 years ago he believed he was the one stepping toward opportunity, while she remained behind in an ordinary life. Tonight the reality looked very different. Daniel reached for a glass of water from a passing tray and took a slow sip, allowing the cool taste to settle his thoughts. For the first time in a long while he was not thinking about how to impress anyone or how to convince investors to believe in his vision. Instead he was thinking about something much simpler and more difficult to admit. He had misunderstood the quiet strength of the person who once stood beside him. Daniel did not feel anger about the past anymore, and surprisingly he did not feel resentment either. What he felt instead was a quiet respect that had arrived far too late to change the decisions already made. He glanced once more across the room as Emily finished another conversation, and began walking toward the exit corridor where several organizers were waiting to speak with her. People stepped aside naturally as she passed, greeting her with polite smiles. Watching that moment unfold, Daniel understood something that no investor meeting had ever taught him. Real power did not always arrive with loud announcements or dramatic victories. Sometimes it grew quietly over time until the world finally noticed. And the woman who once shared his last name had become one of the clearest examples of that truth. Daniel Brooks remained near the tall window as the evening slowly moved toward its final hour. The Manhattan skyline outside shimmered with steady lights, each building reflecting the quiet rhythm of a city that never truly paused. Inside the ballroom the energy had softened. Several guests were beginning to gather their coats while others lingered in small groups finishing their conversations. The piano music had grown slower, almost reflective, matching the calm tone that often arrived near the end of long events like this one. Daniel stood there watching the room, but his attention kept drifting back to one particular figure moving through the final conversations of the night. Emily Carter spoke briefly with the event organizers near the corridor before returning to the ballroom floor to greet a few remaining guests. Even now, after hours of meetings and introductions, her posture remained relaxed and composed. She did not appear rushed or overwhelmed. Instead, she moved with the same thoughtful pace Daniel remembered from years earlier, as if she had always understood that the most important decisions required patience. Daniel realized that this calm presence was something he had overlooked when they were married. At the time, he believed progress meant constant motion and visible excitement. Emily had believed in something different. She had believed that the strongest results often came from quiet consistency repeated day after day. A group of investors near the stage began discussing a recent technology acquisition, their voices carrying lightly across the marble floor. Daniel listened without really following the details. His thoughts had shifted to a different kind of reflection. For the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about the next meeting or the next funding opportunity. Instead, he was thinking about how easily people could misunderstand each other when they only paid attention to the surface of things. Years ago, he saw Emily as someone comfortable with a simple life, someone who lacked the urgency he believed was necessary for success. Tonight, the truth had revealed itself with remarkable clarity. Emily had not lacked ambition. She had simply chosen to pursue it without noise. Daniel took another slow sip of water and glanced again toward the center of the ballroom. Emily had just finished another conversation and was preparing to leave the event with two colleagues from her firm. One of them handed her a folder while speaking quietly about the next morning's meetings. Emily nodded and thanked the organizers nearby before stepping toward the exit corridor. Several guests noticed her leaving and offered polite goodbyes. She responded with the same warm professionalism she had shown throughout the evening. Daniel did not move from his place near the window, but he watched that moment carefully. It struck him that Emily had walked into this room earlier surrounded by quiet respect, and was leaving it in exactly the same way. No dramatic announcements. No need to prove anything. Just the steady confidence of someone who had built her life with clear purpose. As she reached the corridor entrance, Emily briefly turned her head back toward the ballroom, almost as if acknowledging the end of the evening. For a second, Daniel wondered if she had noticed him still standing by the window. Perhaps she had. Perhaps she had not. Either way, the moment passed naturally as she continued down the corridor with her colleagues. The doors closed gently behind them, and the ballroom returned to its ordinary rhythm. Daniel remained there a little longer, watching the reflections of city lights across the glass and realizing that some lessons in life arrived quietly, long after the choices that created them had already been made. Daniel Brooks finally stepped away from the window when the last of the guests began leaving the ballroom. The music had faded completely now, replaced by the quiet sound of staff clearing glasses and folding white linen from the tables. The grand room that had been filled with conversation and opportunity only an hour earlier was slowly returning to silence. Daniel walked toward the exit at an unhurried pace, his thoughts calmer than they had been at any point during the evening. Outside the tall doors, the corridor lights were softer, guiding guests toward elevators and the cool night waiting beyond the hotel entrance. For a moment, Daniel paused near the doorway and looked back at the ballroom one last time. Earlier that evening, he had arrived with a familiar sense of urgency, hoping to convince someone important to believe in his company's future. Instead, he had discovered something far more personal. The woman he once believed he understood had built a life that spoke for itself without needing approval from anyone who had doubted her. Daniel stepped into the quiet corridor and reached the elevator lobby just as the doors opened with a soft chime. A few other guests entered beside him, speaking quietly about meetings scheduled for the next morning. Daniel listened but did not join their conversation. His thoughts had already begun to settle into a clearer perspective. Years ago, he believed success required dramatic moves and bold decisions, the kind that looked impressive in the moment. But tonight he had seen another version of success unfold across the ballroom floor. Emily Carter had not chased attention or recognition when he left their marriage. She had simply continued building something meaningful with the same patience she always carried. The elevator doors opened into the hotel lobby where the city lights shimmered through the glass walls facing the street. Outside, taxis moved steadily along the avenue and a cool breeze drifted between the tall buildings. Daniel stepped out onto the sidewalk and took a slow breath of the night air. For the first time in a long while he felt no pressure to rush toward the next opportunity. Instead he felt a quiet determination to focus on building something real, something steady enough to stand on its own. Somewhere across the city Emily Carter was already moving forward with her next meeting, her next investment, her next carefully chosen step toward the future she had built with patience. Daniel understood now that she had never needed revenge or dramatic closure to prove her strength. Her life had already become the answer. And as he began walking down the avenue beneath the glow of the streetlights, Daniel Brooks finally accepted a truth that arrived quietly but unmistakably. The greatest loss of his life had not been the marriage that ended 3 years ago. It had been the extraordinary woman he failed to recognize while she was still standing beside him.